And now, from a solar-powered shed just north of New York City near a dying mall, which is kind of how most towns are, the beautiful, bold, and brave Pete Dominic. Thank you and me. Oh, those are such kind things that you said about me. Beautiful, bold, and brave. I like it. Hello, my friends. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up. It's the Mental Health Show. I'm going to try to do one of these a week at least because we need it. I need it. And I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Eli Merritt. Dr. Merritt joined me last Monday to talk about his book, How to Save Democracy. Of course, he's a political historian at Vanderbilt University, where he researches ethics of democracy and more. But the first half of his career was dedicated to psychiatry and medicine and medical ethics because he is a trained psychiatrist who went to Yale and Stanford and opened private practices in San Francisco, California. And I thought, hey, well, this guy would be great to talk about, well, almost anything from democracy to psychiatry, but he's an expert on insomnia, depression, addiction, suicide prevention, informed consent, and privacy issues in mental illness. And I thought, this is a guy I really want to talk to about mental health. I've been honest and transparent about my own struggles over the past few years. Well, my whole life I have been, I think, on stage as a comedian and, of course, on the radio and now on the podcast. And so many of you have shared with me and others at our hangouts and in many other ways. And the world is crazy, or so it would seem, and getting crazier. And so everybody's struggling. I feel like everybody is struggling, at least at some point. I think we talk more openly about it, so maybe we've always been struggling. But nonetheless, I want to have a larger impact on that for myself and for you. So I'm going to try to dedicate at least one episode of a week to talking with somebody, an expert, about these issues. Certainly and specifically how they pertain to men, but no doubt that I will have a broad range of issues and subjects and expert guests joining me. So let me know who you want to talk to, who you think I should talk to, what your issues and struggles are. Send me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and we will get after it each and every week here on the show. At least that's the goal. Now, I do want to be clear. My struggles are mine. They're specific to me. Yours are yours, but I do try to keep things in perspective. My life has been good. My life is good. I'm very fortunate. I feel very lucky to have an amazing, loving family, good health, and perfect symmetry in my face. But I do struggle now with concerns and angst about the future, specifically like my future financially, because I love what I do. I love this podcast. I do it every day. It depends on your subscriptions, and maybe I put too much into this and I should have a more diverse portfolio or something of work. But this is what I love. This is what I love doing, and my concern is losing it every day. That's my concern. And I have to work really hard on not being concerned about that. And frankly, if that's the worst thing for me right now, then I think I'm doing pretty good. I try to keep that into perspective, knowing I also try to do my practice every day of meditation, reading, writing, and exercise, because of course I have all kinds of other emotional issues like most of you do as well, dealing with anger and frustration and patience and just emotional reactions to things that it turns out that both people close to me and strangers don't always love when Pete stands up to everything for everything all the time. So I've certainly had to work on that as well. But again, just trying to keep things in perspective, that so many of you are struggling with all kinds of different issues that are different and similar to mine. We're not competing. We're not ranking them. We're trying to help each other get through them, deal with life and the suffering, and find the joy and the happiness. That is what I'm trying to do with these conversations and in life in general. I try to keep that into perspective here, and I will in these conversations, but I definitely want to hear from you about whatever is going on, and I often do. So I'm very appreciative and grateful about that open and honest conversation that we have here, and I hope that we can continue to have it, because I love to hear from you guys no matter what is going on. So on these mental health guested shows. I'm going to avoid the news because that makes you probably a little bit more concerned and depressed, and there's no shortage of that for sure in today's news cycle. But I also want these segments, these hours, to be as evergreen as possible for you to be able to share them with your friends and say, you know, I heard this guy on this show, and I think that you might like it, and it might help you. And so, that all being said, let's get to my guest, Dr. Eli Merritt. I already told you a little bit about his credentials. You can go to merrittmentalhealth.com to learn more about that part of his life. I should warn you that at the very beginning of this conversation, Dr. Merritt tells us about losing his mother to suicide at age 6. And it's pretty brutal to hear, and I just wanted to give you a heads up. But that's where we start, because I asked for him to share his story, and then we really get into it. It's a fascinating conversation about psychiatry, psychology, pharmacology, you know, drugs for anxiety and depression, and how we can get through it all. Eli's a really great guy, and I've enjoyed getting to know him over the past, I guess, week or so, reading his work, and this conversation is real special. I hope you appreciate it. I want to do a lot more of it, so let's get it started with Dr. Eli Merritt right now. So there he is now. Sir, welcome back. You were a big hit as the political historian. I'm very excited to have the psychiatrist joining me today.
Thanks, Pete. Good to be back, however, or whoever I am.
You wear many hats. You have a lot of expertise, and I've really been enjoying getting to know you, as have several listeners since you first joined us. But you told me right before we start here that you had no problem sharing your own story. I've talked about how transparent I've been with my life and struggles as much as I can be here. What is your story, Dr. Merritt?
Well, it's a long story, Pete.
Take your time.
I'll start into it. If I go on for too long, you tell me. I'll try to be brief, but, you know, a life story can be a long thing. Well, I'll start, particularly since you and I are today talking about mental health and mental health problems in our society and our own personal stories. I'll start where I really view things as starting, and that is when I was 6 years old. I had a brother and a sister. They were both 1 year older, so we were 6, 7, and 8. My mother died by suicide. She had a long history of bipolar disorder, had been in some psychoanalysis, had been on lithium. And, of course, I didn't know that at age 6, so suddenly my mother was gone. And so in retrospect, I now understand some of what happened, and that is the brain of a 6-year-old is not really equipped to cope with or deal with the massive thing, which is death, and certainly not equipped to, many adult brains aren't to cope with the massive sort of existential thing in particular, which is, you know, has been described in the literature, self-murder or suicide. So she died. She killed herself with a gun, which was in the back of, I grew up in Franklin, Tennessee, a small town outside of Nashville, with a gun that was not uncommon for even Democrats back then to have, you know, a gun in the house. And basically, the way I recall it is I recovered it almost as though it didn't happen. So I went into a deep repression of what happened in her death. But then when I got into college, I began to crack apart some. I began to experience depression. I began to undergo what I now think of as an identity crisis. So ultimately, I had this deep grief and confusion over her suicide, deep grief over her death. And my first response to that in college and getting out was just to experience an explosion of anger towards her as a selfish person who had abandoned me at age 6. But the progress through that was that from starting in my 20s through about age 45, I'll just tell you what my emotional journey has been. It was first to experience this grief and to the anger and discover that underlying the depression was grief and trauma. And then, so I worked my way through those as part of the practice of psychiatry. I think I was helpful to my patients and didn't turn any of my stuff on them. But then, not until about age 45, after I had begun to speak about suicide, and I wrote a book called Suicide Risk in the Bay Area, did I begin to get free of the shame around my mother's suicide. So there's grief, which manifests as depression until you let it be grief. And then there was trauma, which can block the grief. But then finally, I'm able to talk so comfortably about this today because only in my 40s did I get free of the shame. So that's part of the story. That's the core piece, I think, that's been so influential for me in terms of becoming a psychiatrist and in terms of becoming mentally healthy, relatively mentally healthy at age 56.
The vast majority of people, I'm guessing, that have traumatic experiences like that, or semi-traumatic, or whatever the official you doctors' language you want to use, you'll correct me. The vast majority of people who probably have that in the world, in America, regarding availability of resources, probably never work that stuff out. So we're talking about all kinds of different people. But my question is more, you went deep on yourself, I'm sure, inspired by your expertise, your education is what you're got your degree in. But most of us, even if we identify trauma in our lives, we don't probably get help. We don't know how to. We don't want to, because it's terrifying to have to dig into that. How much of an issue is that with anybody anywhere, that most of us probably deal with stuff and never really get into it for any number of reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. In some ways, I think today, I think there's a problem and there's an opportunity. The opportunity that exists is good psychotherapy, and I'll say not just any psychotherapy, but good psychotherapy, which is a psychological treatment, obviously, but also spiritual pathways, I think, are the opportunity that exist to help us transform depression into just normal human grief, and also to work through the pains of trauma. The challenge, I think, now might be surprising to some people, or maybe not. And that is, in the 90s, as I was in training, the field of psychiatry underwent a tremendous pendulum swing away from psychological and developmental understandings of emotional health and emotional suffering towards, as we know, basically an oversimplified biomedical model or biological model, which was, hey, depression, hey, anxiety, hey, bipolar disorder. These things are no different from diabetes, and they need medications, and they only respond to medications in a way. And I think where we've reached today is, I'm going to say this because I really believe it, I think the extreme medications model that has captured the minds of psychiatrists and enriched a lot of them is a trap that is a direct cause of the escalating suicide risk. And what I mean by that is, if you are lucky enough to encounter a good psychotherapist, if you're having depression and suicidal thinking, and you're lucky enough to encounter someone who's mature and wise and can use medications judiciously, but also approaches you from the perspective of, again, of depression being a form of grief, and there being existential issues that need to be worked through. That's the lucky circumstance. But too many people get caught in the revolving door of medications. And let's think about it. You go in hopeless. Your doctor's, at Stanford, a psychopharmacologist, or Yale, or wherever. They think, wow, I've got the best here. And you get put into a revolving door of medications. Well, after the first one, the doctor says, well, add this, and then we'll add that. Well, by the fifth or sixth, and then you're told this is like diabetes, it's a medical model, you get pretty darn hopeless after your fifth medication. So I believe when those individuals are not offered, well, let's open up the door of psychotherapy and spiritual pathways. These can be remarkable healing pathways for depression and suicidal feelings. If that doesn't happen, I think it contributes to suicide. And that it's just a remarkable, sad paradox, but I deeply believe it's true.
Is your opinion on this an outlier in your field, that the medications that are prescribed are, as you just said, they were related to suicide?
I actually have not seen a lot of people discuss this issue of, again, I don't want to say it is the revolving, let's call it, I've never thought of it this way, kind of the revolving door that ultimately revolves into hopelessness. And that, if you're caught in the revolving door and you can't get out to other pathways, I have not seen too many people talk about that. I really, as you know, I pivoted in 2018 into writing history and political commentary. I do plan to come back to mental health writing, and have started to do a little bit of that on my Substack, American Commonwealth, but I plan to do more in the future. So, no.
I want to sort this.
I don't know that I'm an outlier, but imagine what I just said here. I mean, a lot of people don't want to even begin to think that, and they certainly would feel uncomfortable, much like somebody in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party criticizing their own. And it's a philosophy that a lot of the biological psychiatrists would reject out of hand, because it would be too painful for them to internalize. Because
they've believed one way for so long.
I would be implicating their way of practicing psychiatry with an escalating suicide rate, whereas they think the exact opposite is happening.
They think that they're treating the people and that suicide has gone down, because I think...
No, not that it's gone down. They would say the suicide rate has gone up because of the internet or other things. So what you have, I know either you, Pete, or some of your listeners will recognize this language. We have folks go in for the treatment of depression. Again, we're in the biological model. And then I'm just going to sort of repeat, well, this medication didn't work, this medication didn't work. And at some point, people are given the label refractory depression. I mean, this stuff kills me. And where does it come from? It comes from psychiatrists. I could talk about this a lot. Psychiatrists actually in the 90s sort of moved from being the inferior little brothers within medicine. They weren't really considered real doctors because they really didn't prescribe medications. They were out there doing Freudian stuff or whatever. So doctors, psychiatrists in the 90s in particular, 80s as well, actually starting in the 50s, but a gradual process, they sort of moved up to become physicians. And so how did psychiatrists do this? They adopted the medical model. So other fields describe illnesses that are refractory to treatment or seem refractory to treatment as refractory. So we've just inherited all of this language and the model from other fields of medicine in terms of, generally speaking, general medicine. Some of it is wonderful. There's no doubt about that. I think diagnosis of mental illness is very valuable, but some of it is not, such as, imagine I'm the patient. They're like, well, Eli, we think you have refractory depression and we'll try some more medications. But what now? What now?
What does refractory depression mean?
Refractory means we've tried everything basically and it doesn't respond to treatment. Refractory means does not respond to treatment.
Got it. So where are you in general on medication? Do you think it's okay for some medication? Obviously, a lot of listeners that hear the show, they're on all types of different medication to treat their anxiety and depression, specifically ADD and so on. Do you believe that nothing should be prescribed? Are you entirely anti-drug, or
No, in fact, I'm sorry if that has become apparent.
I didn't think that, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't true, but I wanted to clear up for listeners.
Yeah, I will clear that up. So I practiced psychiatry continuously for about 20 years. And I would say almost all of my patients were on a medication. I would probably say it's 90% or so. And so my way of approaching this, which is the one I recommend generally to psychiatrists and to patients, is particularly if you're suffering a lot, you want the best treatment you can get. And so the best treatment you can get, and studies even demonstrate this, is not medications alone or psychotherapy alone, but the middle path of combination medication psychotherapy. All the evidence points to this as being the most effective pathway to go. So in my treating of patients, I would spend the beginning part of our treatment, talking about what they want to do, and typically recommending a medication as the first step. Then you spend time getting to a somewhat optimal or the best medication treatment possible, one or two medications. Then, however, this is very different from the way a lot of psychiatry is practiced. Then, however, you move into the psychological and or for anyone who's experiencing suicidal thinking, the existential pathways of treatment. And what you don't do is every time there's a perceived setback, I have more anxiety, I'm feeling more emotional pain, you always go back, oh, okay, well, then it has to be a biochemical problem. Let's go back to the medication. Now, I was willing to do that, but what I'm trying to explain now is deep respect, deep love of medications, both because of the biological effects of medications and also because of the placebo effect. And they also bind doctors and patients together. There's lots of things about medications that are great. But then you add the most important component of the treatment is you're a human being, you're suffering. What's going on to cause your suffering? And let's try and find a pathway together in psychotherapy. It took me a long time to finally recommend people also adopt a spiritual practice of some kind. Took me a long time to get to that. But so medications, psychotherapy with a good psychotherapist, and then also some sort of spiritual practice, existential practice, whether it's mindfulness or your form of religious practice or faith practice, I think are the most effective ways to gain emotional groundedness, particularly in a chaotic world.
I want to, at this point, tell you what I've done personally, and so you can help me name it, and so then I can market it for $19.99. On like Twitter commercials, like the cheesiest commercial. No, I want to help name what I feel like gone through and dealt with, because I think it's exactly what you just prescribed. But it took me way too long to find the spiritual practice. And then it took me longer to realize it had to be regular. No one told me. So my issues have always been circumstantial, is how I see it. That's the word I use. I don't feel like I have biochemical anything. I feel like I haven't suffered from trauma from my childhood. I feel like when I'm struggling, when I'm depressed, when I'm anxious, and I have terrible emotional reactions as a result, like that stuff is like what's going on in my life, how I'm feeling about my life, myself, my family, circumstantial, my work, my health, my finances, the world has always impacted how I feel. I look at that as being circumstantial. My shit broke after I lost my job, and then again when my wife wanted to separate. Those are the two times that I really broke. It wasn't until after I was separated with my wife I realized the only thing I needed to forget, working on my marriage. I needed to work on myself. And so I did a lot of research, did a lot of work, I did a lot of reading, and I just basically developed a practice that worked for me. And it's basically 20 minutes of meditation, 20 minutes of writing, 20 minutes of reading some kind of philosophic, anything from Stoicism to Emerson to, I don't care, whatever, some kind of self-help, anything positive that I like. And then usually try to get another 20 minutes to make sure of exercise outside. I rarely get that done. The point is, I went to therapy. I got to the root of a lot of my issues, but I couldn't solve them or treat them for a sustained period of times because I didn't partner it with what I think you're referring to as a spiritual practice. That works for me in terms of what I've done. I've radically changed. I have a long way to go as a result of partnering the practice. And I haven't really been in therapy, but I feel like that's what you're talking about. I feel like that's what I kind of did for myself. And I wonder, your response to how, and I don't think that's particular to men. I can get to some gender stuff, but I wonder, I'll stop there, and your thoughts on that.
Well, it's really interesting to me to hear that what I said really resonates with you. I mean, you did include in that the psychotherapy, the breakdown, the identity crisis, the depression. You didn't really speak of grief, but I imagine maybe you discovered that a underlying trigger was grief over loss of your job, and then grief over potential loss of your marriage. And so that's underneath. And then you found a spiritual practice. I think the aspect of spiritual practice is very broad. And even talking about that really makes me want to learn more from people who say, yeah, well, that was something that I found that's important to me. What is the spiritual practice? And mine was, I actually, after college, and just in the throes of really, really painful identity crisis, again, with grief and depression and unresolved trauma, I had gone to Yale College as an undergrad and studied history. And for complex reasons, including I loved Yale. Yale became a place of great security for me. I went back to the Yale Divinity School after I decided I wanted to go to med school because I had to get all those pre-medical sciences, but I thought, I don't just want to go study those alone. So I studied all the pre-medical sciences while getting ended up being a 2.5-year no, a 2-year degree at the Yale Divinity School, a master's in ethics it was. But I really began in studying Christianity, but I was a very rational person. I remain a very rational person, so I couldn't get it to make any sense. The idea that my cognitive brain is a Darwinist, diehard Darwinist, but I felt a deep longing for some sort of spiritual comfort or spiritual grounding. So in some ways, through processes of what we would call contemplative Christianity, but also through the reading of psychology, particularly Carl Jung, I was able to find sort of make sense of the world in a spiritual way. And some of it is, in fact, that your rational cognition part of your brain does not have to come along if you have a spiritual longing to feel a sense of security and safety in a space of what I think of as a spiritual God. Not a real God, really, but kind of a spiritual God. So I'm bringing that up. And then mindfulness practice became somewhat important to me as well. That's really been important in my wife's life. So I think the actual content or maybe structure or pathway of the spiritual practice is less important. It's very gratifying to recognize that, right? I mean, because there's so many religions and so many pathways out there. Someone just needs to be able to say what you and I are able to say is, I found my spiritual practice, and in addition to clinical psychology and biological understandings, it's very important to me. It remains very important in my life right now.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you don't even have to necessarily name it, although it makes it more interesting, I think, to share, because somebody might want to steal a little bit of it. But as long as you have something that you do, and I think I would like to get hung up on the word practice, because I think that's what was missing from me. I think therapy helped me name and identify what was broken in me and why I behaved the way I behaved, and helped me even with some tools to change my behavior. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a lot of what I did, but it wasn't until I realized that I needed to have this practice and I needed to aim to do it daily, that I could put it all together and be better in almost every way as a person. Yeah.
And for some reason in our conversation now, I'm reminded of, because I've been talking about mainly democracy for the past few years.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a strong belief I have in something I've said hundreds of times in the past. And that is that mindfulness practice is the most important thing to wash up upon the American shore since democracy. And it's interesting for me to remember I have these two interests, but I really do believe that, because in some ways these practices counteract precisely what are the unfortunate excesses that exist in a particular culture, right? I mean, the Dalai Lama doesn't need that to wash up on his shore, because it would be like, oh, I already understand all this stuff. I don't need this. But Americans really need this stuff. And now you brought up Stoicism. Now we're seeing Stoicism really wash up on the shore of America. And thank God for that. That is just wonderful. Stoicism, I've written a few pieces about Stoicism. In fact, I can't remember the name of it right now, but one in the Los Angeles Times was about how to cope with grief during Christmas. I think it came out the day before Christmas in the Los Angeles Times. And I had read through a large collection of Seneca's letters and just thought, this is the greatest stuff in the world. So I shared it with others. And it was very popular. They put it out on the wire, and other newspapers could pick it up, and it was picked up. So
I just found it.
Oh, you did? The world is hungry for Stoicism. So just if anybody's, I'm underscoring it because you brought it up. I'm an advocate of mindfulness, Buddhist practice.
Yep.
I'm an advocate of Stoicism. My original practice is Christianity. That's not quite in favor as much, because so many crazy Republicans are practitioners of it in a very different way from me. But there's a lot of options out there.
A lot of options out there. You mentioned Stoicism, and Ryan Halliday's made that popular. There's podcasts. A friend recommended a podcast. And I think that if you just try to read Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, you forget about it. It's written in whatever the translation is, it's still too highbrow for most of us that are looking to just understand what they were saying. So it's been translated down.
I'll say Seneca's letters, I don't know the translation, but it's in that article. You might see it right there. I named the translation. It is not highbrow. And their collection of letters written to a friend, everyone can read that, and it is fantastic. I mean, if you want to read a 700-word summary, like my op-ed, fine. But if you want to go deeper, I just want to let you know, in general, you're right about the impenetrability of some of these writings. But that collection by Seneca is just wonderful, easy to read.
Were Seneca alive today, he would not advocate passivity in the face of climate change and a global pandemic. He would advise us to fight and sacrifice for our values at all costs, as he did during his lifetime. I just randomly picked a sentence to read from your op-ed.
Thanks, yeah.
I will share that in the show notes for people to read. I did want to ask you specifically about gender. A few years back, a columnist at the Boston Globe named Billy Baker wrote a piece about men of a certain age and how loneliness was basically literally killing them. And it went absolutely viral. A friend of mine from high school read it and reconnected a bunch of us on a text message. I interviewed him. He eventually wrote a book about it. And my general feeling through hosting this podcast and becoming friends with a whole bunch of men is that there's a lot of truth to that, where we get to a certain age and we just don't have the types of relationships and conversations and friends in our lives on a regular basis as maybe we once did for any number of reasons. And as a result, we're depressed and we're lonely and we're searching. And I know that you've obviously talked about the importance of community throughout your work. And I wonder if I'm getting hung up on gender. I feel like there's such a difference between men and women for so many different reasons at this age and when it comes to relationships and friendships and even community. But I'm happy to be wrong or to try to understand it as it relates to everybody.
I think you're very right about that, and it resonates in my own life. And I see, and my wife sees in our lives, that she and her friends just naturally get together socially much more than I do with my friends. And even if I think about that, I mean, why is it that men don't get together as much for coffee or for a walk or to go to an art gallery or something like that? I've historically gotten together with friends socially to get a beer, and then even more for sports. So I do think that that's there. And if we try and piece it apart, I agree with you. Is it culture? Is it biological? Or is it both of those? I think it's probably both of those. And I'm not going to make assertions about gender because I'm uncertain of them, but are men more competitive with one another? Is this idea of machoism important to this phenomenon? Does it feel needy to reach out and tell a friend, hey, I was thinking of you and just wanted to get together for a walk? I mean, even as a man, I feel like, what? That sounds a little strange. We should get together, for a beer or for lunch or dinner or something. So I think it's real. And importantly, and this is related to gender and also not, I, for years and years and years, have believed we live in a culture that actually does not foster a sense of community. So what does that mean for us? It means that we really kind of have to work quite hard to be in community in order not, as you say, to be lonely and therefore to grieve, which is manifested for people as depression, but it's actually grief. You miss something. There's a loss of connection with others. So I think we have to work. I've learned that going back decades. You have to work very hard, often men more than women, to build community. So it starts with what you said. You got to recognize that being at home alone all the time or loneliness is something that has a negative impact on our mental health. And we have to be proactive. We have to admit that to be true. And then we have to be proactive in basically creating community for ourselves, just as you said you and your friends did after that article came out.
Let's say I meet up once a week to play in a soccer league, and maybe we even have beers after the game, but I'm still not telling any of my teammates, maybe some of them have become friends, about what I'm dealing with. And the reason I'm not doing that is, I think you touched on it, is because this is America and I'm a man and I don't want you to know about my struggle. I don't want to look vulnerable or weak. And I'm a certain age. I should be, I have it under control at this point. But at this age is when a lot of things start coming apart. Marriages, jobs, you're not where you thought you would be. I'm about to experience something that I know is going to be really challenging for me, which is that my daughter's going to move out. She's like she's my best friend. Like, we're very close. I love being around her. I'm going to miss her dearly. And then my younger daughter is going to be there and probably struggling because she's going to miss her best friend. And my wife and I, I'm anticipating that. I think that we don't talk about these things because we don't want to look vulnerable. And even if we were comfortable talking about them, we have a hard time articulating our feelings. We may not have even identified them. I'm just struggling. I don't know why. I feel like that's a very specific to a lot of men our age. It's anecdotal. I'm not a scientist, but having hosted the show, sharing my shit, and then seeing the flood that comes back, which is both thank you and here's mine, which I welcome because we all can share, has been the evidence that I am raising this as such an important issue and hopefully in this case, the experiment as we're conducting here for people to hear this.
Yes, and then there's another disadvantage. See if you agree with it, that since you're married, it's kind of not okay for you to have female friends. And I say that because I have in my life had lots of female friends. In fact, when I began to experience my emotional difficulties, if I think back to that time, I can't think of a male friend that I was sharing my emotional struggles with, but I can think of 2 or 3 women in college who were still very close friends of mine that I shared with. And so there is something here about, and it kind of makes sense if you think of evolution, you think of, men supposed to go out and hunt and be the protectors and go and fight in wars. I mean, it makes sense that we might have evolved in this direction of more of a shell around our emotions. And as I think of myself now, I do now have a couple of male friends that, like with you. I mean, you're a new male friend, Pete, that we can talk about our emotions with. So I do have that, but it's fascinating for all of us to think of our different friends and how we are with different people. And much of that has to do with, I can think of a friend right now that if I were to sort of bring up some of the topics we're discussing now, his anxiety level would shoot through the roof and he would want to change the subject. Well, I just know that I love this person, but nevertheless, that's how he is. So I don't tend to be vulnerable.
That's the difference between you and I. And I'm not even joking. You're more thoughtful, you're more mature, and you're a psychiatrist. So you wouldn't, I say to my friends who are not good at being vulnerable, I say to them, I know you aren't good at this. And I know this is making you uncomfortable, which is why I'm doing it to you right now. And they don't like it. And I don't know that I'm making a difference, but it is kind of like it's only someone with a, very trusted friend, I think, really. But I mean, I just reached out to a friend of mine and left him a message. And I think this is a really great way for men to communicate, for anybody to communicate, but we're leaving messages for each other on this app, video messages. And I have a lot of reasons why I believe this, but you're just spouting into a phone and you don't see the other person's face reacting in real time. And there's just a level of comfort there. I'm going to leave it all out here. And then more importantly, he will have time to digest that message and think about how he wants to respond. And that is a non-traditional form of communication to a certain extent that I think has been really helpful to me and a lot of men. And so I told my buddy all these things I admire about him, and knowing that it would make him a little bit uncomfortable. And he came back with a very funny, "You're real good at that. I'm not. It was great to see you. Thank you very much for all those nice things you said about me. Gotta go."
What is the app? What is the app, Pete?
It's called Marco Polo. I've tried it. I want to get him as an advertiser because I truly, I would only want to sell things I really support and believe in, but it's been really beneficial for a lot of men. I talked to a lot of listeners using it, and it's just this really, I feel like somewhat unique to men. I mean, obviously I'm using gender, but there are always exceptions. I'm generalizing. It just gives you.
Let me say, Pete, that your approach to this, and I'm not just trying to flatter you. I mean, I'm always learning. your approach to this is, I think, more healthy one than mine, in saying I notice the anxiety level go up, and so I kind of guide myself otherwise. And particularly since you're such a funny guy, I'm sure you handle a lot of these circumstances where anxiety goes up with humor, which can disarm that anxiety. But I think your approach is the right one, is to not shape yourself necessarily based upon the person that you're speaking with. But even before this podcast, you and I were talking about, I was saying it's amazing how different I am on different podcasts with different people. And it's very, so what I'm saying is a principle that's true of all folks. But you're even doing a whole show here that is based upon you. You're not going to shape yourself. You're just going to speak as a vulnerable person and talk about your painful experiences in your life. So that's what we need more of. So I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad to be a part of it today.
Well, can I try to sell you then my spin? Because how to sell this, which is a lot of this is about ego, a masculine ego, and I don't want to appear weak. But what I'm trying to tell the Navy veteran, Navy SEAL, I don't know, the most masculine guy in the world, what I'm trying to tell him is there's nothing braver than confronting your fears. So you might just jump out of an airplane because you're scared. I'd do that. I'm scared to do that too, but I would do that. But it's much harder to confront your childhood trauma. It's much harder to admit that you are struggling. And therefore, it takes a lot of strength. Why don't we measure strength that way, as opposed to the way that we measure strength and kind of masculinity and machismo with these more traditional ways? No, it takes strength to actually confront your shit. That's really hard. If you can get there, we should be applauding it the same way.
100%. I think you're right. Now I'm going to switch back to democracy and say these things are connected, because more than anything, I think to restore strength and faith in our democracy, what we as citizens, and mainly our political leaders, need to do is to mature. I mean, I deeply believe in this concept of human maturation, and people can read about it. You go from these immature defense mechanisms to these mature defense mechanisms. And I think you are right that it takes strength and courage to confront and then work through our emotional pains. I mean, so much so that I think it's important to recognize that for a lot of people, myself included, and then I talked about this for years with patients, that it's not just the courage. It is, undergoing an identity crisis and then a breakdown that becomes a breakthrough. In order to undergo that, it is like your whole internal infrastructure is falling apart. So it is frightening as hell. And you do need the assistance of community support, an expert, a psychotherapist, whatever it is, because there is just this sense of breakdown. So a lot of people avoid this, not just because they have the defect of being overly macho, but because to break down and then break through actually really feels like an earthquake. And what really it is it does feel like an earthquake, but here's what's cool. It's not. It is not. There is ultimately emotional difficulty and danger, but there's nothing, it feels life-threatening, but actually nothing life-threatening is going on. It just feels that way.
I like that. I think that when I first became a parent, I read a lot of books, specifically even for raising girls. And I learned a lot, but I think what I learned the most was, I think it was Dr. Chaim Ganat, Children Learn What They Live, or at least that was the subtitle, something like that. It was this idea that kids, a lot of their suffering is because they feel so alone in their suffering, in their pain. And instead of giving them advice or trying to fix it, sometimes the best thing you can do is just name it for them or identify it and be empathic. I'm so upset that I can't have my friend over. It really does stink that you can't have your friend over. I hear you. I wish you could. I'm sorry you can't this day. And you name it, and all of a sudden, and I would see this as I started practicing it, my daughters would bounce right back and move on in so many different ways. As adults, I feel like the same truth applies. I feel like my suffering, my pain and my grief, my depression, whatever you want to call it, I so often feel like I am alone, and nothing could be less true and more unoriginal, especially than my suffering, Eli. I mean, really, like, my shit is so mediocre and nameable. And I'm not trying to be like, it just is. Like, I've had a pretty good life. I've been real lucky. My wife, on the other hand, you know, and many of my listeners have suffered like all of the traumas. But the point being, I still feel like I'm the only one dealing with this sometimes. It's the same as when I was a kid and when we were kids. What is that called, and what do we do about it?
Well, let me pause. My mind got a little bit stuck on you talking to your daughter, so you might have to ask that again. But just imagine another parent talking to their daughter in the same circumstance. Well, I really want to have my friend over. And you say, stop whining. You don't deserve to have your friend over because yesterday you did this and the day before that you did that. I mean, this stuff, I'm sure you agree, Pete, is so destructive. And you should repeat on all of your shows just what you said about the way you interact with your daughter.
I have always talked about.
It's just, I'm sorry, you're straight out of 100 textbooks on how to parent effectively children. So I'm sure you've read some of these books, so you learned that. But you can repeat it. You just said something like, you know, I'm sorry you can't do that. I mean, I'm not going to change my boundary and my decision, but I know that it's painful for you, and I respect that pain you're experiencing. I've done this with my children. I mean, they are many experts on grief because your daughter's grieving. That's the fact of what, if you get biologically down to what she's undergoing, is it's a sense of grief. But I just wanted to underscore that, and that's one of them.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear you say that, and because it worked. I mean, I should have given a better example. I was trying to think of something when they were very young, but, you know, even when they're older, they didn't make the team. They didn't get the part in the play. Yeah. And there's any number of different ways to answer that, to deal with that too. And I think a lot of times, had I not learned that, I would have tried to fix it. I would have tried to tell them, but instead just naming it. So as an adult, when I feel that way, that the question is, I still feel that way. I still feel alone. And I feel like that's what community creates. That's what even one good friend creates. So you're going back and forth with, I have a very close friend who somebody should do a study on us. We've talked every day almost for 2 years. He lives in Australia and we haven't seen each other in person.
Yeah.
And we tell each other everything. And it's just, we both have ups and downs and we share it. And it feels so good to just be heard and have it be named. And I am so lucky to have that guy and plenty of others in my life. And I want to share that, Eli. I want to spread that. I want guys to understand that, people to understand that that's a huge part of the problem, and you're not alone. You got to share it with somebody, because I guarantee, and that's what I was trying to say with some levity, my shit is really relatable, really relatable.
Yeah. And, back to the question of shame, as I analyze in myself right now, why I think you're ahead of me on this capacity for total sharing with others. I'm going to be honest with myself that I think some of the things I don't talk about with some of my friends may relate to probably or directly the result of shame. And so I think, we've all these complex emotions that we talk about, there can be envy and jealousy and anger and grief and depression and guilt. I just want to share that I think shame is the most powerful. I've seen this in people I know well and patients I've treated and in myself. And it obviously we evolved shame because we want to have a democracy that's very dissimilar from shameless Donald Trump type of democracy. Right. It explains a little bit his shamelessness. There was a good piece in the Times about his shamelessness. But shame is very important to the healthy functioning of a social order. There's no question about that. But I think otherwise in our personal life, shame is, I can't think of real values that come with shame. So if other people are like me, you might speak to that. But if other people are like me, don't take your eyes off of shame, because it is, if something that feels it's unhealthy going on in your life, attribute it to shame until you prove otherwise that that's not the cause of your suffering.
I'd be real curious as to a guy with your credentials and career and intellect calls shame for himself personally.
What do I struggle with shame?
I mean, what do you name?
I didn't think I did until just on the show with you now, and I recognize I'm not as open and comfortable telling my whole story to my network of friends as you are. So I'm comfortable with that. I'm always learning. I do feel really quite healthy, but it just beautifully reminds me of this place, of that shame place in our lives. So you too, all of us, I'm not singling myself out, nor anyone else, but just we should always keep our eyes on shame as a chief source of our suffering. And to explain all of the things I would say that you've been talking about today that you're so interested in is what's going on with men? Why are men isolated? Why aren't they sharing? Why aren't they vulnerable? I'll bet you if we do a careful analysis of it, shame is the reason. Oh,
yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of it, by the way, is I'm not as successful as I thought I would be, because there's such a premium put on that I feel like, even, by the way, the quote, most successful people often feel that way because it's never enough, certainly not in America. And I would always think this, as a comedian, I recognize this very early, that Jay Leno and Jerry Seinfeld were never happy. And they never took time off, and they always worked. And it was never enough to a certain extent. At least that's how I saw it with them. And I said, if they're not, then I'll never be happy. I'll never find joy, sustained joy relating to my career or wherever I get, because it'll never be enough if they're not. And I said, well, I'm not going to be, I don't want to be that guy. And then I think I focus a lot of what I defined as success on what made me happiest. And what made me happiest was being with the girls and my wife and my family. And so I kind of cut my career in half, focused on that, gambled, and I think mostly succeeded. We'll still see. There's plenty of time for me to be living in a container store, closet, eating cat food. But I definitely am happy that I took that risk and made that choice. Whereas another friend of mine, same age, made millions, top of his game, miserable, hates his wife, doesn't like his kids, doesn't like his job that he made millions in. Like, that's an extreme case. Yep. But there's a whole bunch of us in between that. But I think it's easy to get caught up in shame. And I certainly I feel that way now, even when, how come I'm not doing better than I am? I think we all tend to feel that. But I think so much of that is ego driven based on your career, your status, Eli.
100%. I'm so glad you brought that up, because you were talking about success, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to share with him my view about success and the vast importance of defining success in a healthy way. Then you went on to describe that. Here's the thing I came to, and again, and some college students, it's one of my favorite things to talk to college students about is, how do you define success?
Yeah.
And I'll just tell you how I used to define success and how I do define success today, which I know will resonate with you because you've been talking about it. I used to define success, of course, based on career and being noticed and being admired and people saying, hey, did you hear this thing that Eli did, et cetera, et cetera. And still, that's kind of nice. Now, maybe that's a little bit of icing on the cake today. But again, in my 20s, during my time of troubles, so to speak, I radically came to redefine what success was. And what success became was having meaningful relationships with people in my life, with my friends, with my family members. And then the second component of what it meant to be a successful person was that I felt I was, to the best of my abilities, kind and loving and good to others. So that is, to this day, how I define success. I really don't define success at all in terms of resume achievements, CV achievements.
Yeah,
I like that stuff. It's nice. I'm glad to have it. It feels good. But if you let that be the core of how you define yourself, then you're going to be miserable for the reasons you've said, because you can never stay ahead of everyone in terms of your achievements. And then, of course, you age and die. And you're not going to be achieving too much on your CV when you die.
Well, I don't care much for kindness and loving and being good. I want to crush my competition.
That's it.
I want to win. At the end of my life, I want to have won and beaten everybody and crushed everybody. That is what drives me and gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, that's the old you, Pete. That's not the new you.
Oh, yeah. No, I never won. Like, I really did not win. Like, I played a video game, football game against my roommate 300 times, and I won one time. And he, before the game could record it, he turned the game off, so it could not record my win. And
my gosh,
that's how I start every therapy session.
You were a glutton for punishment, it sounds like.
I think I agree with what you said. I love that you said that. And I want to continue talking and defining all of these words and making them as relatable as they can for people. So I will let you go. This is the beginning of our conversation. I already feel closer to you, and I'm excited to continue talking about all of what you speak to and write about, both democracy and psychology, mental health, all of it. Thank you so much for helping me get started and understand a lot of these ideas that are just kind of jobbling around my head.
Thank you, Pete. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Jobbling around my head. The hell word was that? I was really struggling there. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Eli Merritt. I'm sure you have questions, concerns, comments generated by it, and you always will. So I'd love to hear from them. standuppwithpete@gmail.com is my email, and I look forward to hearing from you. Would you like to have more of those conversations? Can I do that once a week? Is that something that you enjoyed? I'd love to know. Give me your feedback. Email me, let me know, and hopefully we'll talk about it at this week's Hangout, which we do every Thursday night with listeners, subscribers, people who subscribe to the show, which you should and hopefully will do. Standuppwithpete.com, patreon.com/Pete Dominic to do that now. All right, folks, that's all I've got for you on today's show. Thank you to Dr. Eli Merritt. Thank you to, of course, John Carroll for the music. Hopefully we'll get Pete Cat? He loves cats. Pete Coe back in here doing our openings at some point this week because I miss him. But that's it for today. I hope you have a great day, and I'm grateful for you listening. Really, really grateful. Thank you. And here's today's inspirational quote to end the show. Smart people learn from everything and everyone. Average people from their experiences. Stupid people already have all the answers. Oh, I think that encapsulates this show each and every day. Thanks, Socrates. Talk to you tomorrow, folks.
No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.